It started as a quiet night in Queens, a night meant for reflection and remembrance. The kind of night where families come together, where friends gather to find some semblance of peace after tragedy. Outside the Amazura concert hall, the crowd was growing. A young man's memory was being honored, his friends and family celebrating what should have been his 17th birthday. Candles flickered in the cold air, laughter mixed with quiet sobs, and for a moment it seemed like the pain of loss might be overshadowed by love and unity. But the streets were darker than usual that night. The air carried a strange weight, something almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore if you stood still long enough. A car slowly rolled by, its headlights briefly illuminating the faces of the crowd. Was it curiosity? A passerby paying their respects? Or something far more sinister? No one could have known. Not yet. The memorial carried on. Conversations grew louder, the warmth of community pushing back against the chill of the evening. But then, a sound cut through the noise, a sharp, jarring crack. Some thought it was fireworks at first. Others froze, unsure of what they had just heard. And then came the second crack, and the third. Panic erupted as over 30 bullets tore through the night. People screamed, running in every direction, unsure of where the shots were coming from, or how many shooters there were. Those closest to the building dove for cover. Others, caught in the open, had nowhere to run. When the chaos settled, 10 young people lay wounded on the cold pavement. 6 women, 4 men, all between the ages of 16 and 20. Friends who had come to honor a life now found themselves clinging to their own. The assailants? Gone. Witnesses saw them flee in a light-colored sedan, its out-of-state plates disappearing into the night. The venue lights dimmed, sirens wailed in the distance, and the questions began. Who would do this? Why would someone turn a peaceful memorial into a scene of carnage? And was this an act of random violence, or something far more deliberate? What happened that night outside the Amazura concert hall was more than just a tragedy. It was a riddle, one that has left a community broken and desperate for answers. But as the investigation unfolds, we'll learn that this isn't just a story of bullets and blood. It's a story of grief, revenge, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. Queens, New York. A borough known for its diversity, its quiet neighborhoods, and its bustling streets filled with dreams and hard work. But on this particular New Year's night, the streets of Queens would bear witness to a violent act that no one saw coming. Outside the Amazura concert hall, a place usually filled with music and celebration, a different kind of gathering took place. This wasn't a concert, this wasn't a night of partying, it was a memorial. Tayarian Mungo, a 16-year-old who had been tragically murdered just a few months earlier, was at the center of the night's remembrance. His friends and family had come together to mourn the loss of a life cut too short. The crowd, though grieving, was hopeful. In the darkness of their sorrow, they found comfort in the company of one another. It was a night to remember Tayarian, a night to heal, to reflect, and to hold on to the memories of a young man who was gone too soon. But by the time the clock struck 11:20 p.m., everything had changed. In the blink of an eye, this peaceful memorial would transform into a scene of horror. A drive-by shooting so fast and so brutal, it left 10 young victims lying in the streets. Some were hit by bullets, others were injured in the chaos that followed. 6 young women, 4 young men, ages ranging from 16 to 20, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or so it seemed. But was it? The attackers didn't stay around long enough to give answers. They fled the scene in a light-colored sedan with out-of-state plates, quickly vanishing into the night. Within minutes, the sirens began to wail, and the streets of Queens were flooded with first responders. The community was left in shock, unsure of what had just occurred. The wounds were deep, not just physically, but emotionally. As word spread, speculation began. Was this a random act of violence, or was there a deeper motive behind the attack? Some whispered about gang rivalries, about a history of tension between local factions. Others pointed to the possibility of a personal vendetta, someone with a score to settle. Could this have been an attempt to send a message? The investigation was just beginning, and the authorities were scrambling for answers. Was it a targeted attack, planned, calculated, and precise, or was it simply a tragic coincidence? One thing was certain, the answers wouldn't come easily. And as the community of Queens began to search for clues, they had more questions than ever before. Before the chaos, before the gunfire shattered the night, there was a boy, Tarian Mungo, a son, a brother, a friend. At just 16 years old, he had a promising future ahead of him, his whole life still unfolding. But in October 2024, that future was stolen in a violent and senseless act. Tarian's life, though short, was one filled with promise. He was known for his kind heart, his infectious laugh, and his deep love for his family and community. Friends described him as someone who was always there for others, quick to lend a hand, to share a laugh, to lighten the mood during the darkest of times. But Tarian's life came to a tragic end when he was murdered just a few months before the memorial. The circumstances of his death left many unanswered questions, and though his killers were never found, his memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved him. On this fateful night in December 2024, his family and friends gathered in his honor at the Amazura Concert Hall, a venue that had become a hub of the community. Known for hosting concerts, events, and gatherings of all kinds, Amazura was more than just a venue. It was a place where memories were made, where bonds were formed, where moments of joy and sorrow were shared. For the community, the Amazura was a symbol of unity, a gathering spot for celebrations and remembrances alike. It had seen countless nights of music and dance, of laughter and tears. But that night, it became the backdrop for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The crowd that had gathered was not large, but it was full of heart. Family members, friends, and loved ones came together to pay their respects. Tarian's mother, devastated by the loss of her son, stood at the forefront, a pillar of strength in the face of her grief. Around her, the young people who had known Tarian, his peers, found solace in each other's company. Among the crowd were the victims of that deadly night. 6 young women, 4 young men, all between the ages of 16 and 20, each with dreams and aspirations that would never be realized. They were there to remember a friend, to honor his life. But in an instant, they became part of a story they never wanted to be a part of. Jada, 19, a bright and ambitious young woman with dreams of becoming a nurse. Her eyes, full of hope and determination, had been looking toward the future until that night. She was standing near the front of the crowd when the first shots rang out, and in an instant, her life was changed forever. Jeremiah, 18, a quiet but thoughtful young man, had just graduated high school. He had dreams of becoming an engineer, of making a better life for himself and his family. He'd been at the memorial to pay his respects to Tarian, but now he lay in the hospital, recovering from the wounds that had nearly taken his life. Monique, 16, had just begun to explore her passion for fashion design. A rising star in her own right, she was known for her creativity and sense of style. She had plans to attend a design school after graduation, but that night her future was forever altered. The victims were not strangers to the pain of loss. They had all felt the sting of grief in one way or another, but they had come to heal, to stand together in memory of Tarian. And then there was the setting, the Amazura Concert Hall, now forever etched in the minds of those who witnessed the horror. The venue, which had once been a place of music and community, was now a symbol of the senseless violence that had occurred outside its walls. The street outside the Amazura, typically bustling with energy and life, became a crime scene in the blink of an eye. Police barricades went up, yellow tape crisscrossing the pavement where moments before people had been standing in the warmth of shared memories. The area, now cordoned off, was eerily quiet, save for the distant wail of sirens and the hum of helicopters overhead. Images of the aftermath show the devastation, police lights flashing in the distance, the street littered with debris, the wounded being rushed to nearby hospitals. It was as if a wave of violence had washed over a community that had only come to pay their respects. For the survivors, those who managed to escape the barrage of bullets, there would be physical scars but also psychological ones. They would carry the weight of that night with them for the rest of their lives. The trauma, the horror, the confusion of what had happened outside the place where they had gathered to mourn, it would linger long after the physical wounds healed. The victims weren't just numbers. They weren't just casualties of a senseless crime. They were real people, with real dreams, real families, and real futures. And now their lives, like Tahirian's, had been forever changed by the violence of that night. As the investigation began, their stories, along with the chilling reality of what had occurred, would soon take center stage. The search for the truth had only just begun, and with it came the questions that would haunt not just the survivors, but an entire community. Was this just a random act of violence, or was there something more at play? Was this attack a part of something much bigger than anyone realized? As the night wore on, the crowd outside the Amazura concert hall was filled with a quiet sense of remembrance. It was a somber gathering, but there was an undercurrent of celebration. A celebration of a young life lost too soon, but also of the bond shared between the people who came together to mourn him. Friends, family, and acquaintances of Terry and Mungo had gathered, some in groups, others standing alone, quietly reflecting. Laughter occasionally echoed through the crowd, not out of place, but as a momentary relief from the weight of grief. They shared stories of Tahirian, the good times, his goofy smile, his love for music. His mother stood among them, her heart broken but proud of the son she had raised. She found comfort in the voices around her, knowing that Tahirian's legacy lived on in those who had come to honor him. The air was cold, but the warmth of shared memories kept the chill at bay. People had come to pay their respects, to mourn a young man who had lost his life too early. But what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly foreseen, was that this night, meant for healing, would soon be forever marked by chaos and terror. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. when everything changed. In the quiet of the evening, with the sounds of muffled conversations and occasional laughter filling the air, the first shot rang out. The sound shattered the peace. A crack of noise so sharp and sudden that it felt like a punch to the gut. Then came another, and another. The crowd at first was slow to react. Perhaps they thought it was a car backfiring or fireworks from some distant celebration, but the sound of gunshots was unmistakable. It wasn't long before panic spread like wildfire. People dropped to the ground, scattering in all directions, trying to find cover to protect themselves from the violence that had erupted on their doorstep. The gunshots came in rapid succession, over 30 in total, each one echoing across the streets of Queens. The attackers, driving a light-colored sedan, had pulled up and opened fire from the street, targeting the crowd with ruthless precision. It was over in a matter of seconds, but to those who were there, it felt like an eternity. Jada, standing near the front of the crowd, felt the rush of adrenaline as she ducked behind a nearby car. Her mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest. The world seemed to blur around her, the sounds of gunfire deafening, the screams of the people around her mixing with the rapid thudding of her own heartbeat. She had heard the stories of drive-by shootings in the city, but never thought she'd be caught in one. Jeremiah, not far from Jada, had the same reaction. He dived to the ground, feeling the heat of the gunfire pass just inches above his head. His body trembled as he lay flat against the cold pavement, his breath shallow. His thoughts were scattered. How had this happened? Who were they shooting at? Why here? Why now? For Monique, the horror was much closer. She had been standing near the memorial, a few feet away from Tahirian's mother. The sound of the gunshots was enough to send her into a panic. She sprinted toward the nearest alleyway, hoping to escape the carnage, but before she could take cover, a bullet grazed her arm. Pain flared, but she didn't stop running. The world around her had dissolved into chaos, and her only focus was survival. The victims were scattered across the area, some injured, some just too terrified to move. People ran in every direction, trying to escape the madness, to get away from the rain of bullets that seemed to come from every angle. It was a blur of motion, confusion, and fear. Witnesses later recalled seeing the attackers in a white sedan, speeding away from the scene, their faces obscured by masks. The car's tires screeched as it vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but chaos. The sirens came quickly, but in those moments, it felt like an eternity before the first responders arrived. Police officers and paramedics rushed to the scene, trying to help the wounded to restore order to the madness. But the damage had already been done. By the time the dust settled, 10 young people lay injured, their lives changed in a moment of violence. Some were left with bullet wounds, others with the trauma of having witnessed something no one should ever have to experience. The echoes of that night, the screams, the chaos, the confusion, would stay with them forever. The initial reports were grim. 5 people had been seriously injured, while others were treated for minor injuries. Among the wounded were Jada, Jeremiah, Monique, and several others who had been standing too close to the line of fire. Some would recover, their physical wounds healing with time, but the emotional scars would last far longer. Witnesses, too, were left in shock, unsure of what had happened. The random nature of the attack, its suddenness, left people struggling to process it all. Was this a gang-related hit? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or was there something deeper at play, something more personal driving the violence? The victims were rushed to nearby hospitals, their lives hanging in the balance as doctors worked tirelessly to treat their wounds. In the aftermath, as the streets of Queens were cordoned off by police, the questions began. The community was in shock, struggling to make sense of the horror they had just witnessed. People who had come to mourn a lost life had found themselves victims of a senseless act of violence, their lives now forever tied to that dark night. The investigation had begun, but answers were few. The attackers had fled the scene so quickly that there were few leads, no eyewitnesses who could clearly identify them. The mystery of that deadly night had only deepened, and as the hours passed, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a simple case. There was something more here, a story yet to be uncovered. The night was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. The streets of Queens were no longer alive with the sound of gunshots, but the damage had been done. The sense of peace and community that had existed moments before had been replaced by a cold, unsettling quiet. In the aftermath of the attack, the world seemed to slow down, almost as if the city itself was taking a deep breath, trying to process what had just transpired. The first officers on the scene were met with a chaotic scene. Victims were being rushed to the hospital, ambulances swarming the area, and the sound of sirens cutting through the night. The initial reports were grim. Over 30 shots fired, 10 victims wounded, and no clear suspect or motive. But one thing was clear. This was no random act of violence. The NYPD's response was swift, as it always was in cases like this. Detectives were on the ground almost immediately, combing through the crime scene for any clue that could lead them to the perpetrators. Shell casings littered the ground in front of the Amazura concert hall, remnants of the deadly barrage that had been unleashed on the crowd. A total of 31 spent cartridges were found, spread across the street like pieces of a puzzle that needed to be pieced together. The trajectory of the shots suggested a drive-by shooting, and law enforcement quickly deduced that the shooters had been firing from a moving vehicle, their aim likely honed by years of experience. But the mystery deepened. No one had seen the attackers. Witnesses were too scared to come forward, many too traumatized by what they had just witnessed. Those who had been there in the moments before the shooting were now paralyzed by fear, unwilling to speak. Some knew who might be responsible. Others had theories. But when it came time to help the police with their investigation, silence prevailed. Detectives began reviewing surveillance footage from nearby stores, cameras placed along the street, anything that could give them a glimpse of the shooters. It didn't take long before something important was discovered. A white sedan, clearly seen in the moments before the gunfire erupted. The car was parked on the side of the street, just beyond the crowd, its engine running in the background. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to get a sense of the car's make and model, a late-model sedan, likely stolen. In the footage, the vehicle slowly pulled away just as the first shots were fired, disappearing into the distance before the police could react. There was no plate number visible, and the car's tinted windows made it nearly impossible to identify the occupants. But it was a start. The investigators were cautious, but their instincts told them this was not a random act. No one had been specifically targeted, but the randomness of the attack made it seem even more calculated. The idea of a gang-related hit quickly surfaced. In Queens, where the divide between rival gangs was often deadly, the possibility of a personal vendetta was not far-fetched. Detectives spent days piecing together a timeline of events. They interviewed family members of the victims, spoke with local witnesses, and scoured social media for clues. They found that some of the young people at the memorial had ties to local gangs, but it wasn't clear if they were affiliated with any particular group. As much as investigators wanted to draw connections, every lead seemed to lead nowhere. The neighborhood was tight-knit, but fear had gripped it. Residents knew something wasn't right, but no one wanted to speak up. The streets where people had once shared laughs now felt cold and unfamiliar. Rumors began to spread. Was this a case of mistaken identity? A gang retaliation gone wrong? Or was it something deeper, something that had been bubbling under the surface for years? As the investigation continued, frustration mounted. The police had collected valuable evidence, but the lack of cooperation from witnesses and the community at large was a major hurdle. Despite the tragic nature of the attack, there were no clear answers. The families of the victims were desperate for justice, but with so few leads, it seemed like the case was slipping through the cracks. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure began to build. News outlets covered the incident extensively, and the community's anger grew. The public demanded answers. The victims' families held vigils, calling for justice, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The streets of Queens, once a symbol of resilience, now felt like a battlefield. The shooting had left an indelible mark on the community, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, violence could strike without warning. The police knew they were running out of time. Every day that passed without an arrest felt like a day lost, a day further away from the truth. But the community wasn't going to give up. Local leaders, activists, and community organizers began to rally, urging people to speak out. They posted flyers, held press conferences, and organized marches, calling for justice for Tayarian Mungo and the other victims. The message was clear. Someone had to be held accountable. But as the investigation continued, it became evident that this case was not going to be solved easily. Whoever was responsible for the shooting had planned it meticulously. They had left little evidence behind, and every lead seemed to fizzle out. The investigators turned their attention to the possibility that the attack was part of something larger, a series of interconnected events or a long-standing feud between rival gangs. As the months wore on, new evidence began to surface, pointing to the possibility that Tayarian Mungo's memorial had simply been the wrong place at the wrong time. But with every lead, there were more questions. Who were the shooters? Were they hired to do this? What was their motive? The answers remained elusive, buried beneath layers of fear, silence, and uncertainty. But the hunt for the truth would continue, no matter how long it took, because in the end, someone had to pay for the bloodshed. The victims of that deadly night, and the community they left behind, deserved nothing less. The investigation was at a standstill. No one had been arrested, and the questions surrounding the deadly shooting outside the Amazura concert hall continued to swirl in the air like a thick fog. What seemed like a random tragedy had now become a perplexing mystery, one with layers that were impossible to peel away quickly. As law enforcement and the community speculated on the motives behind the attack, several theories began to surface, each more unsettling than the last. The most obvious theory, the one that had the police and community buzzing, was gang retaliation. Queens, like many parts of New York City, had a history of gang violence. There had been whispers in the streets for years about the rivalries between different factions, each one competing for control of territory and respect. Tayarian Mungo, the young man whose memorial had brought everyone together, had ties to a local gang. He wasn't known for violence, but his connections and reputation made him a target, whether for personal reasons or as part of a larger, unspoken vendetta. His death in October had been tragic, but it also could have sparked something much larger. What appeared to be a peaceful gathering to honor a young man who had been tragically taken too soon might have instead been a flashpoint in an ongoing gang war. Some speculated that the shooting was a form of retribution, a warning shot fired by one gang at the members of another. The question remained: was Tayarian's memorial merely a cover for this act of vengeance, or was there something more to it? Had someone in the crowd been specifically targeted and the others simply caught in the crossfire? Local police weren't convinced, but the theory persisted. There was no doubt that gang activity in the area had been on the rise, and it wasn't uncommon for conflicts to turn deadly with little warning. But there were significant flaws in the theory. For one, the shooters hadn't specifically targeted anyone from a rival group. They had opened fire indiscriminately, hitting a variety of people, most of whom had no known gang affiliations. So if it was retaliation, it seemed haphazard and poorly planned. Then there was the theory that the attack was connected directly to Teerian's death. Some people close to the case believed that someone involved in the shooting felt personally wronged by him. Teerian had been young, but his life had been marked by struggles, as many young people in troubled communities face. He was known to have had enemies, people who resented him for things that had happened before his death. Could this attack have been a continuation of those grudges? Had Teerian's killer, or someone close to him, decided to take revenge on the people who attended his memorial, thinking it would send a message? One key witness, a friend of Teerian's, came forward with information suggesting that Teerian had been involved in a physical altercation just weeks before his death with someone who might have had a motive to retaliate. This created a chilling possibility. The shooting was not random, but rather a targeted attack designed to send a strong, violent message. It could have been someone seeking revenge for a past injury, someone who knew that the memorial would be the perfect place to strike. However, the NYPD was careful to tread lightly on this theory. The challenge was that no one could definitively link Teerian's death to the shooting outside Amazura. No concrete evidence had been found that connected the two events directly, even though many speculated that they were connected. The more detectives dug into the relationships surrounding Teerian, the more complex and murky the motives became. Another possibility was that the shooters had targeted the wrong crowd altogether, that this was a case of mistaken identity, or that the shooters had no idea they were firing at people who were merely attending a memorial. With so many people crowded outside the concert hall, it was easy for someone to misidentify their target, especially if they were in a rush and operating under the cover of darkness. Several local residents voiced their opinions about this possibility, with one saying, "I've seen it happen before. Sometimes people get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It could have been a random attack, not even aimed at the people who were hit." This theory seemed to be the least likely to the police, who were inclined to believe that this was no accident. Yet, as they re-examined the video footage, some key details raised questions. The car had pulled up slowly, almost deliberately, right before the shooting. If the shooters were in a hurry, why had they taken their time in positioning themselves before the assault? Was this a strategic move, or were they simply confused about their targets? Even as law enforcement officials leaned away from this possibility, they couldn't rule it out completely. It was an unsettling thought that perhaps the victims weren't the intended targets, but they had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. To add more weight to these theories, law enforcement experts, community leaders, and local gang members were interviewed, each offering their perspective on the shooting. The police were particularly concerned about the lack of clear evidence, but local residents and activists were becoming more vocal. One local activist, who had spent years working with youth in the area, explained, "We've seen this happen before. The violence, the fear, it's all part of the cycle. It's not just about gangs. It's about the lack of opportunity, the frustration. These young men, they don't see a way out. And sometimes, the violence comes from that desperation." On the other hand, law enforcement professionals were careful not to get caught up in the community's emotional response. Detective Maria Delgado, who had been on the case from the beginning, shared her thoughts. "Everyone wants answers, and we understand that, but we can't let emotions cloud our judgment. We have to look at the facts, not the rumors. Gang violence is a real issue, but so is the possibility of personal revenge or simple misidentification. We have to stay open to all possibilities." As the weeks turned into months, these theories continued to linger in the air, never fully confirmed, but never fully dismissed. The investigation was still in its early stages, and each new lead only seemed to muddy the waters further. The more evidence that was gathered, the more questions arose. Could it have been a random act of violence? A mistaken attack on an innocent crowd? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Something deeper, rooted in personal grudges or the unrelenting grip of gang warfare? Theories abounded, but in the end, one thing was certain. Someone was responsible for turning a night meant to honor a young life into a night of terror. The pursuit of the truth continued. But with every passing day, the mystery of what had truly happened outside the Amazura concert hall became even more elusive. And so the community waited, hoping for a breakthrough, but knowing that the answers might be far more complicated and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Months into the investigation, with few answers and more questions piling up by the day, it seemed as if the case was heading toward a dead end. The streets were quiet, but the murmurs behind closed doors were growing louder, a community desperate for justice, and a law enforcement team struggling to make sense of the chaos. But then, just when it seemed as though all hope was lost, a break in the case came from the unlikeliest of sources, a whistleblower. It wasn't a grand confession, nor was it a revelation from the most obvious source. It was a piece of information that seemed innocuous at first, but would go on to shatter everything investigators thought they knew. The first lead came from an unexpected witness, someone who had been a part of the crowd but had kept their distance from the police. After the shooting, the fear of being involved had kept most of the attendees silent. Some were afraid of retaliation, others simply wanted to move on with their lives. But one person, whose identity we cannot reveal, finally came forward with crucial information. It was a small detail, something they had seen but didn't initially think would matter. The witness had been near the entrance to the Amazura concert hall when they noticed a sedan parked across the street just before the shots rang out. The car had its engine running, and its occupants seemed to be watching the crowd, sizing up the situation. At first, the witness thought it was just another vehicle passing through, but something about it felt off. And then came the revelation that would turn the case upside down. After hearing the details of the witness's testimony, investigators began to piece together a chilling timeline. The sedan hadn't just been idling, it had been in the area for nearly half an hour before the shooting. What had seemed like an innocent car now seemed suspicious. Law enforcement officers immediately began tracking down the license plate number from the witness's description. They traced it to a sedan registered in a state far from New York, a detail that raised eyebrows. Why had the vehicle come all the way from another state? And who were the individuals behind the wheel? It wasn't until investigators traced the sedan's plates that a shocking lead emerged. The car was registered to a person with a criminal record, someone with connections to known gang members. The plot thickened. This wasn't just a random attack. This was something far more calculated. The breakthrough didn't stop there. Surveillance footage from a nearby business revealed something even more disturbing. 3 masked figures, emerging from the shadows, heading toward the car. They weren't dressed like ordinary partygoers. Their movements were deliberate, purposeful. Their faces hidden, but the way they walked, the way they carried themselves, it was clear these weren't just some random thugs. They were organized. Authorities now had their eyes on a group of individuals who seemed to have connections both locally and out of state. The idea of a random drive-by seemed less and less likely. The emerging theory? This attack might have been part of a much larger operation, an execution, not just a random act of violence. As the weeks wore on, the pressure mounted on the police to deliver answers. But with every piece of the puzzle that came together, new questions emerged. Who were these masked men? Were they acting on their own, or were they carrying out orders from someone higher up in the criminal food chain? The stakes were growing higher, and the clues were becoming more disturbing. The NYPD, in a rare statement to the public, confirmed they were following promising leads and that they were closing in on the individuals responsible. But for every lead they chased down, another twisted path seemed to unfold. What was clear was that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger story. Law enforcement officials stated they were still piecing together the full scope of the operation. Was this a gang-related hit, or was there something more at play? The out-of-state registration raised many questions. Had this been planned in advance? Had someone come from another state to carry out the shooting? Or was this simply an organized criminal enterprise that spanned multiple regions? But as the investigation pressed on, there were still many unanswered questions. For instance, if this was indeed part of a larger operation, what was the ultimate goal? Was this a warning to rival gangs, or was it connected to something more personal, a vendetta tied to the memorial? And perhaps most disturbingly, was there a larger criminal network still operating in the shadows, pulling strings without anyone realizing? In a statement to the press, Detective Maria Delgado, who had been overseeing the case, shared her growing concerns. "We are looking into the possibility of multiple individuals being involved in the shooting. The investigation has led us to some alarming discoveries, but we are not yet ready to release all the details. What I can say is this: we are committed to getting to the truth, and we will not rest until we bring those responsible to justice." The community, too, was reacting to the news. There was hope, but also frustration. For the residents of Queens, this wasn't just a story on the news. It was their lives, their families, their children who had been impacted. One local resident, a mother of two, expressed the feeling many were grappling with. "We've been living in fear for so long. This is just one more thing that shakes you to your core." But if this is what it takes to get answers, then we have to stand behind the investigation. We need justice for those kids. As the search for the shooters continued, the tension in the community grew. People who had once felt safe attending local events now feared what would come next. Would this be the start of even more violence? Or could the NYPD's new lead finally bring closure to the case? The whistleblower's tip had ignited the investigation. It had connected the dots in a way that was both chilling and revealing. Now, the question remained: would the police be able to close in on the suspects before the story took an even darker turn? Or were they about to discover something even more devastating than they could have imagined? The whistleblower had given the NYPD the first real breakthrough in the case. But the question remained: who else was involved in this deadly scheme? And would the investigation lead to even darker revelations? For now, only time and the relentless pursuit of justice would tell. As the investigation continued to unfold, the emotional and social impact of that fateful night rippled throughout the community, reverberating far beyond the initial headlines. The shooting outside the Amazura Concert Hall wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a stark reminder of the struggles faced by many in the neighborhoods of Queens and other parts of New York City. For those who survived that night, the trauma of the shooting would stay with them forever. But it wasn't just the victims themselves who were affected. The pain was felt by families, friends, and an entire community, one that had gathered to mourn and celebrate life, only to be forced into an unimaginable reality. "This wasn't supposed to happen," said Tamika Johnson, the mother of one of the young victims who was injured that night. "We were there to remember a life, to honor a young man who was taken too soon. And now we're left with nothing but questions and heartbreak." Her son, 19-year-old Marcus Johnson, had been standing at the edge of the crowd just moments away from his future. He had plans, hopes, and dreams, none of which would come to fruition that night. His family, along with the families of the others, now faced a new battle, the emotional toll of dealing with the aftermath of a senseless act of violence. The victims' families, once hopeful that their children might attend a safe gathering, were now grappling with the question of why their loved ones had to be subjected to such terror. Why them? Why here? Why now? These were the questions reverberating across the lips of countless parents, siblings, and friends in the aftermath. The devastating injury toll, 10 young victims, each with their own life cut short in different ways, was a stark reminder of the fragility of life in a world where violence often seems like an ever-present threat. But even in the face of overwhelming grief, the community displayed resilience. It was clear that they would not be silenced. They had already been through so much: the loss of Terry and Mungo, the violence that plagued their streets, but they would not let this shooting define them. Local leaders and activists like community organizer Javier Ramos rallied together in an effort to bring attention to the broader issues at play. This isn't just a one-off. This is the result of years of neglect, of poverty, of gangs running unchecked through our neighborhoods. The city needs to step up and protect our youth, Ramos said in an interview. We need better resources, better opportunities, and most importantly, better protection. Because this violence, this senseless loss, it can't continue. Ramos, who had been a vocal advocate for youth programs and anti-violence initiatives, highlighted the deep-rooted problems that had contributed to the tragedy. Guns aren't the problem, they're a symptom of something much deeper, he continued. We're talking about generations of young people who feel they have no other options, who are being pulled into gangs or criminal activity because they feel like they have no choice. Until we address those systemic issues, we'll keep seeing more of the same. His words echoed across the community. There were numerous calls for action, not just to find the shooters, but to address the underlying issues of gun violence, gang involvement, and youth safety. Community meetings, rallies, and vigils became the rallying points for citizens who wanted change. The collective grief turned into a collective resolve. We can't just sit back and watch our kids die in the streets, said a local pastor, Reverend Charles Johnson, during a prayer vigil held a few days after the attack. We have to take a stand. It's time to demand better from our leaders, time to demand change, and time to demand justice for those we've lost. The focus, however, remained on the victims, young people who had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, some of whom had nothing to do with the violence that erupted outside the concert hall. Each of them represented a life that had been abruptly and unnecessarily disrupted. Some of the victims had plans to attend college, start businesses, and give back to their community. Others were simply out for a night of camaraderie, remembering their friend. I know my son had dreams, said Mrs. Johnson, wiping away tears during an interview. He wanted to become a nurse to help people, but now he's just a statistic. While the community mourned, there was also a sense of anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The idea that their children, young people full of potential, had been targeted either by mistake or as part of a larger criminal scheme was unacceptable. For many, the realization that this was yet another incident of gun violence that had claimed innocent lives was a bitter pill to swallow. Every time something like this happens, it feels like we're all failing, said Clara Martinez, a longtime resident of Queens. The politicians talk about fixing the streets, but nothing changes. We're just trying to survive out here. Martinez's words were echoed by others in the community who felt that their voices had been ignored for far too long. While there had been efforts to reduce gang violence and increase police presence, many felt the systemic issues that fueled these acts of violence — poverty, lack of opportunities, and the proliferation of illegal guns — were being overlooked. For many, this tragedy served as a stark reminder that their children were living in a world where violence was too often the answer to conflict. And for those who had survived that night, the emotional scars would take far longer to heal than the physical wounds. But in the face of such overwhelming loss, the people of Queens refused to be defeated. They rallied for justice, for answers, and for a future where no one would have to live in fear. The shooting outside the Amazura concert hall may have been a senseless act of violence, but it had sparked something much greater, a movement to demand better, to fight for their children's safety, and to ensure that this tragedy wouldn't be forgotten. The scars would remain, but so would the strength, the courage, and the unwavering desire for change. We won't stop fighting for them, said one survivor, his voice full of determination. We owe it to them. As the community grieved, they also began to rebuild, to hold each other up, and to demand the justice that had been long overdue. They knew the path ahead would be difficult, but they would not walk it alone. The tragedy outside the Amazura concert hall would not define them. It would propel them toward change. And as they said their final goodbyes to their loved ones, they vowed to honor their memory by continuing the fight for a better, safer future for the generations to come. As the investigation into the shooting outside Amazura Concert Hall continues, there are still more questions than answers. How could such a devastating attack take place at a memorial? Was this the result of a personal vendetta, a gang-related dispute, or simply a tragic mistake? And will the shooters ever be caught, or will they vanish into the shadows, leaving families and the community without closure? The pain is far from over for the families of those injured, and the residents of Queens are left grappling with the harsh reality that for many, the streets remain unsafe. But amidst the grief, there is also a growing sense of urgency. People are speaking out, demanding action, and calling for justice for the victims. This crime is more than just a news story. It's a rallying cry for those who want to see change, for those who want to end the cycle of violence that seems to plague their neighborhoods. What will it take to prevent another tragedy like this? What changes need to be made for the safety of our communities? And who will step up to make sure this never happens again? "We have to do better," said one local resident, her voice shaking with emotion. "It can't just be thoughts and prayers. We need real action, real solutions now." And while the future remains uncertain, one thing is clear: the people of Queens and those across the city are not backing down. They won't stop until the shooters are found and brought to justice, until the names of those lost are remembered, and until there is a real change in how violence is dealt with in their communities. But that leads us to the next question. What will become of the investigation? Will new leads finally break the case wide open? Or will it fall into obscurity? Like so many other unresolved shootings, will the shooters be caught, or will they remain free to cause harm again? We want to hear from you. What do you think happened that night? Was it a targeted attack, or was it something more complex? Who do you think is responsible, and what do you believe needs to change in our society to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again? Leave your theories in the comments below. We're reading them all. As the community continues to mourn, and as the investigation presses forward, there is no telling where this case will go. But what we do know is that the pursuit of justice is not over, and it will take the collective voice of the people to demand accountability and make sure that those responsible for this deadly night are held accountable. And as we close this chapter of a devastating story, we ask, will there be justice? And what is next for the grieving families and an entire community determined to fight for change? In our next episode, we dive into another chilling case where a quiet suburb turned into a crime scene overnight. Stay tuned. This one will shock you.